So we start conversation about the respiratory system, and let's first talk about the functions of the respiratory system. Of course, it delivers oxygen and expels carbon dioxide. It filters, humidifies, and warms up the incoming air. It plays an important role in the maintenance of the blood pH, and it assists in the control of the homeostasis, the body temperature and the fluid homeostasis. It also participates in the production of sound. There are two major anatomical parts, upper and lower respiratory tracts. Upper respiratory tract consists of the nose and the nasal cavity, pharynx and larynx. The structures warm, moist, filter, and humidify the air. Lower respiratory tract, trachea, bronchi, and the lungs. They deliver the air to the sites where gas is exchanged between the blood and the environment. So nose, essentially the first site where air is filtered, humidified, and heated up. The hairs in the nose filter out the particles. Mucus present in the nostrils serves as a trap for the small particles of the dust or fungal spores. The epithelium that covers the nasal cavity is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and cilia move mucus away from the lungs in the nose. And of course, an important function of the nose is the sense of smell. When air passes the nasal cavity, it enters the pharynx. Pharynx can be crudely divided into three parts: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Nasopharynx, closest to the nasal cavity, is covered with the pseudostratified ciliated epithelium and participates only in respiration. Oropharynx, here, and laryngopharynx participate both in the digestive and respiratory activities. When somebody swallows the food enters oropharynx and goes down into the laryngopharynx. The structure called epiglottis, shown here, when we swallow, the structure closes the entrance into the larynx, therefore preventing the food from entering into the respiratory passages. Auditory tubes that connect oropharynx and nasopharynx and middle ear, they allow us to equalize the pressure in the middle ear and in the environment. Now, larynx is the last structure of the upper respiratory tract before the lower respiratory tract commences. It is composed of cartilage, and it keeps the respiratory tract open. That cartilage prevents your respiratory tract from collapsing. One of the main functions of the larynx is to produce voice. Vocal cords, or voice box, produces the sound of voice. Not the speech, but the sound of speech, sound of voice. The thyroid cartilage that forms anterior wall of the larynx forms what we know as Adam's apple. The flap of elastic cartilage on top of the larynx, epiglottis, as we just mentioned, covers the opening into the trachea, into the lower respiratory tract, preventing food from entering into the lower respiratory tract, specifically the lungs. Now, if we move lower, if we move down from the larynx into the lower respiratory tract, we're going to find three structures of the lower respiratory tract, namely trachea, bronchial tree, and the lungs. The function of these structures is simply to move the air towards the respiratory membrane, towards the site of the gas exchange. So there is a conducting zone and the respiratory zone in the lower respiratory tract. Conducting zone is trachea, bronchi. Of course, pharynx, larynx, and nasal cavity also belong to conducting zone. And the respiratory zone will be alveoli in the lungs. We're going to get there. So here you can see the trachea that conducts the air from the atmosphere towards the bronchi. It branches into two primary bronchi. This primary bronchi branch into the what we call lobar bronchi. Lobar bronchi branch into the segmental bronchi, and they keep on branching, and when bronchi branch into the smaller conducting passages, when bronchi branch into the smaller bronchioles, bronchi become thinner, the walls become more elastic, they contain less cartilage, and they also contain more smooth muscles. Now, trachea is about 2.5 centimeters in diameter, and it is composed of the hyaline cartilage and the muscle called trachealis muscle that allows trachea to expel mucus when tracheal mucosa is irritated by some kind of a dust particle or something like that that gets stuck in the trachea. So trachea does not collapse because of the cartilage that is found in its wall. The very bottom of trachea, structure called carina. When anything solid, it can be very, very small particle, touches the carina here, it initiates a cough reflex to expel this small particle from the trachea. Now, trachea branch into primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on bronchi. There are 23 orders of branching. So right bronchus, right primary bronchus, is branching into 3 lobar bronchi by the number of lobes in the lung. And the left bronchus, left primary bronchus, branches into 2 lobar bronchi. Lobar bronchi branch further to the secondary or segmental tertiary or segmental bronchi, and segmental bronchi, they branch even farther into the bronchioles, and eventually bronchioles produce what's called terminal bronchioles. That's the last structure of the conducting zone. Terminal bronchioles finally branch into the respiratory bronchioles, but this time respiratory bronchioles, along with alveoli, they form a respiratory zone in the lungs. So as we already mentioned, when bronchi branch and become thinner, they also increase the amount of smooth muscles in their walls, and there is a decreased amount of cartilage. Actually, cartilage is replaced with the connective tissue. Now, lungs, that's where actual respiration, actual gas exchange happens. They fill up the rib cage, and they extend all the way from the clavicle to the 12th rib. The base sits on the diaphragm. When diaphragm moves down, lung volume increases. When diaphragm moves up, lung volume decreases. Right lung is shorter but wider, and it has 3 lobes. It's bigger than the left lung because the left lung has to give some space to the heart. That space called cardiac notch. Lungs are covered by the serous membrane called visceral pleura. So visceral pleura essentially covers the lungs, while the parietal pleura lines the walls of so-called pleural cavity, part of the thoracic cavity. In that cavity, the space between 2 pleural membranes, which is referred to as pleural cavity, is filled with the serous fluid. When bronchioles supply bronchopulmonary segments, and then bronchioles keep dividing eventually leading to terminal bronchioles. Terminal bronchioles give rise to respiratory bronchioles. And at the end of the respiratory bronchiole is the alveolar sac, composed of multiple grape-like structures called alveoli. So the walls of that alveolus are adjacent to the wall of the capillary. So basically you have 2 very thin layers of cells. You have a wall of alveolus composed of simple squamous epithelium, and a wall of blood vessel also composed of simple squamous epithelium. In alveoli, you also can find septal cells that produce surfactant. This surfactant prevents alveoli to collapse and stick together when you exhale. It reduces the surface tension of the alveolar walls. Fluid also makes the gas diffusion across the respiratory membrane, gas diffusion from the alveolus into the blood flow, into the blood, more efficient. So far we figured that there are septal cells that produce surfactant. We figured that there's simple squamous epithelium that essentially forms the wall of alveolus. Alveolar macrophages clean up the alveoli. They remove the particles, the pathogens that did not get stuck in the mucus. And in the alveoli, the gases diffuse in a certain direction. Oxygen, it goes from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillary, into the bloodstream. Carbon dioxide exits blood and goes from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli to be exhaled. So this is how alveolus looks like. You can see the alveolar cells here, simple squamous epithelium in the alveolar cell. You can see alveolar macrophages and septal cells. Septal cells, as we mentioned, produce surfactant, and macrophages clean up the mess. And here you can see the respiratory membrane. You can see the respiratory membrane right here. So the respiratory membrane consists of the epithelial cells that forms the alveolar wall, the epithelial cell that forms the wall of the blood vessel, and the basement membrane between them. So essentially you have a cell, and a membrane between them, and that is the respiratory membrane. It's very thin, and this is why the diffusion of gases is extremely efficient. So obviously The process that occurs in the respiratory membrane is the diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli into the blood and diffusion of CO2 from the blood to alveoli. Quite obviously, in the systemic capillaries, it goes the other way around. Oxygen diffuses from the blood into the tissues. We're talking about systemic capillaries. We're talking about the tissues. The carbon dioxide diffuses from the tissues back into the blood.